You're thinking about someone you haven't spoken to in years, not casually, but with unusual intensity, their face appearing in your mind with a clarity that disrupts whatever you were doing, and within hours they call. Or you've been wrestling with a specific problem for weeks, turning it over obsessively without resolution, and a book falls from a shelf in a room you rarely enter, opening to the exact page containing the answer, framed in language that feels impossibly tailored to your situation. Or you keep seeing the same number sequence, 1111, 333, 444, appearing on clocks, receipts, license plates, in contexts that feel too frequent to dismiss as random. The rational part of your mind says coincidence, statistical noise, pattern-seeking bias hardwired into a brain desperate to find order in chaos. But something else registers these moments differently, not as mystical intervention or divine communication, but as disruptions in the ordinary flow of cause and effect that seem to carry meaning you can't quite articulate but also can't quite dismiss. The question isn't whether these experiences happen. They do, consistently, across cultures and throughout recorded history, to nearly everyone, regardless of belief system. The question is what they reveal, not necessarily about the universe sending personalized messages, but about how consciousness organizes information, constructs meaning from pattern, and occasionally glimpses connections that exist just outside the framework of linear causality that structures ordinary perception. The difficulty with synchronicity is that it occupies an uncomfortable space between two incompatible interpretive systems, neither of which can fully accommodate the phenomenon. The materialist framework dismisses these experiences as confirmation bias, the brain's well-documented tendency to notice and remember events that align with pre-existing expectations, while filtering out or forgetting contradictory data. You think about a friend, don't call them, nothing happens, and you forget the thought entirely. You think about them, they call within the hour, and you remember because the coincidence creates emotional salience, triggering the release of neurochemicals that encode the memory more deeply. From this perspective, synchronicities aren't real phenomena deserving investigation. They're artifacts of selective attention combined with post-hoc storytelling, the mind's compulsive need to construct narrative coherence from random events. The mystical framework does the opposite. It treats these moments as proof of cosmic intelligence, divine guidance, or interconnected consciousness deliberately sending tailored messages to individuals who are spiritually attuned enough to notice. The universe becomes a benevolent parent offering course corrections, encouragements, warnings. Both frameworks contain partial truth, and both miss something essential. The materialist account can't adequately explain why certain coincidences carry transformative psychological weight that persists long after the event, why they often occur in clusters during transitional periods, or why they sometimes involve information the person couldn't have accessed through normal channels. The mystical account conflates subjective meaning with objective mechanism, assuming that because an experience feels significant and carries emotional or spiritual import, it must necessarily originate from an external intentional source with agency and purpose. What neither framework addresses adequately is the possibility that synchronicity reveals something about the structure of consciousness itself, how meaning emerges at the intersection of inner and outer, how attention shapes perception in ways that create feedback loops between observer and observed, and how the psyche operates at the boundary between subjective experience and objective reality in ways that remain theoretically unmapped. Carl Jung developed the concept of synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle, arguing that certain events are linked not through conventional cause and effect, but through meaning, a form of connection that doesn't operate through the transfer of energy or information in any mechanistic sense. He worked alongside quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli for years to explore whether this connecting principle might operate at a level deeper than either psychology or physics alone could describe, what they termed the psychoid realm, a theoretical domain where psyche and matter become indistinguishable, where the usual boundary between mental and physical dissolves into something more fundamental. Jung wasn't proposing magic or supernatural intervention. He was proposing that the ordinary causal model of reality, the billiard ball physics of discrete objects acting on each other through force and contact, is incomplete, That there exists a dimension of experience where internal psychological states and external events correspond not because one causes the other in any linear fashion, but because both arise simultaneously from a deeper organizing pattern or field. The archetype in Jungian theory functions as this organizing pattern. It's not a thing you can locate or measure, but a structuring principle, a formal cause that shapes both psychic content and the unfolding of events in the world in ways that occasionally create visible overlap, moments where inner and outer mirror each other with uncanny precision. When someone is going through a profound identity crisis, for instance, and starts encountering symbolic representations of death and rebirth everywhere, in dreams, in overheard conversations, in art they encounter randomly, in synchronistic meetings with people who embody themes of transformation, the Jungian interpretation isn't that the universe is sending personalized curriculum designed for their growth. It's that the archetype currently active and constellated in their psyche is drawing material both internally and externally, creating a temporary alignment between inner process and outer manifestation that feels like meaningful coincidence, but might be something more fundamental about how consciousness and reality interact. This interpretation remains deeply controversial in mainstream science, because it requires accepting that consciousness might not be fully contained within the individual brain, that it might interact with or emerge from fields of organization that extend beyond the skull and possibly beyond the body entirely. Neuroscience resists this vehemently. The dominant materialist model treats consciousness as epiphenomenal, a byproduct of neural activity with no causal power over external events, essentially steam rising from the engine but having no effect on how the engine runs. And yet the research on meaningful coincidences, sparse as it is, reveals something interesting that doesn't fit neatly into either camp. People who experience more synchronicities show measurable differences in brain activity, specifically in alpha wave patterns associated with sensory inhibition and heightened pattern recognition. They're not hallucinating or experiencing delusions. They're processing information differently. Their brains are more permeable to ambiguous stimuli, more willing to construct meaningful patterns from noise, and less constrained by the filtering mechanisms that normally screen out the vast majority of irrelevant sensory data to prevent cognitive overload. This doesn't prove that synchronicities are objectively real in the sense of being caused by external cosmic forces or universal intelligence, but it does suggest that the experience of synchronicity corresponds to a real and measurable cognitive state, one where the boundaries between self and environment become more fluid, where the detection of patterns operates at a threshold that allows for both genuine insight and interpretive error, and where meaning-making becomes more active and less constrained by conventional causal logic. The challenge then becomes distinguishing between two fundamentally different kinds of pattern recognition, both of which feel identical from the inside. One kind is adaptive and potentially revelatory. It allows you to notice genuine connections that are present but not immediately obvious through linear analysis. The entrepreneur who keeps encountering the same business idea in different unrelated contexts over the course of weeks and recognizes it as a meaningful signal to pursue that direction, only to discover later that the market was indeed shifting in exactly that way. The person trapped in an unhealthy relationship who starts seeing representations of imprisonment, entrapment, and escape everywhere. In movies they watch, books that fall into their hands, conversations they overhear, and finally understands that their psyche is trying to communicate through symbol what they haven't been willing to consciously acknowledge, that they need to leave. The other kind is apophenia, seeing patterns that aren't actually there, constructing elaborate narratives from random data, and mistaken coincidence for cosmic confirmation of beliefs that may have no basis in reality. The person who believes the universe is punishing them because they encounter obstacles and difficulties after making a particular decision, interpreting every setback as divine disapproval rather than the normal friction of material existence. The one who decides that every minor inconvenience, a red light, a delayed package, a friend canceling plans, is a sign from the universe that they're on the wrong path. becoming paralyzed by the need for external validation of internal choices. Both involve the exact same cognitive mechanism, the brain's prediction machine trying to match incoming sensory input to pre-existing expectations and mental models, constructing meaning from pattern. The difference is whether the pattern detected corresponds to something genuinely present in external reality, or whether it's being imposed onto random noise by a mind desperate for coherence and significance. And that distinction is maddeningly difficult to establish in real time, especially when you're the one inside the experience. What makes synchronicity psychologically significant, regardless of its ontological status, isn't the external event itself, but the internal response it triggers in the person experiencing it. When a meaningful coincidence occurs, when the boundary between inner and outer suddenly seems permeable, it temporarily disrupts the ordinary mode of consciousness that treats the self as a separate, boundaried entity moving through an indifferent external environment. For a moment, however brief, that separation dissolves. Internal and external feel unified by meaning, connected by pattern, participating in the same field of significance. This can be profoundly destabilizing or deeply clarifying, depending on the person's psychological structure and relationship to uncertainty. For someone rigidly identified with rational materialism, synchronicities create intense cognitive dissonance. The events can't be easily explained away using the available framework, but accepting them as genuinely meaningful threatens the entire worldview that provides psychological security. This often results in either rigid dismissal, explaining away the event through increasingly elaborate rationalizations that preserve the materialist framework, or obsessive attempts to find conventional causal explanations that eliminate the need to revise the underlying model of reality. For someone overly identified with mystical or magical thinking, synchronicities become evidence of specialness, divine favor, or elevated spiritual status, which can dangerously inflate the ego and lead to grandiosity, narcissism, or psychotic breaks, where the person believes they're receiving direct communication from cosmic intelligence and loses the capacity to distinguish between meaningful pattern and delusional thinking. The healthier response, rarer and requiring considerable psychological maturity and comfort with ambiguity, is to hold the experience lightly, to acknowledge that something subjectively meaningful happened, without needing to construct an entire metaphysical system to explain it, or prove its objective validity, to let the moment widen your sense of what's possible, what consciousness might be capable of, without collapsing into either reductive skepticism that dismisses all anomalous experience, or inflated self-importance that treats every coincidence as cosmic endorsement. Synchronicities often intensify dramatically during periods of significant psychological transformation, when the existing identity structure is actively destabilizing through grief, loss, spiritual awakening, existential crisis, or deliberate inner work. The psyche becomes more receptive to symbolic material, and the person's relationship to external events shifts. This isn't necessarily because the universe suddenly starts sending more signs, or because reality itself changes. It's because the person's attention fundamentally transforms. The default mode of consciousness, which under ordinary conditions is highly selective and filters the vast majority of incoming sensory data to preserve cognitive efficiency and prevent overwhelm, begins to relax. The person becomes more present, more attuned to subtlety and nuance, less defended against ambiguity and contradiction, more willing to notice what doesn't fit established categories. In this state, patterns that were objectively always there become subjectively visible for the first time. The book that's been sitting on the shelf for 5 years suddenly feels urgently significant because the question it addresses has become psychologically pressing. The conversation overheard in a cafe lands with transformative force not because the content is objectively profound, but because the internal readiness to receive that particular insight has suddenly crystallized. What changes isn't necessarily the external environment, though one could argue that shifts in attention do create shifts in what you encounter through subtle changes in behavior and choice. What demonstrably changes is the quality of attention, the lens of perception, the receptivity to meaning that you're bringing to the ongoing flow of experience.
This also explains why synchronicities so often involve material that the person is projecting, psychological content they haven't fully integrated or consciously acknowledged. A person struggling with unexpressed anger but maintaining a persona of constant accommodation might keep encountering aggressive people, finding themselves in situations that provoke rage or witnessing conflicts everywhere they go. Someone avoiding necessary grief might find that losses pile up in ways that feel impossibly orchestrated. Pets dying, relationships ending, objects breaking, as though reality itself is forcing confrontation with the emotion they're desperately trying to bypass. These aren't cosmic punishments or universal lessons delivered by an intelligence with pedagogical intent. They're the psyche using external events as mirrors for internal states that haven't been fully seen, acknowledged, or metabolized.
Mechanism projection, the process by which unconscious content gets externalized and encountered in the world as though it belongs to other people or external circumstances. When the projection is active and charged with emotional energy, synchronicities related to that content dramatically increase, not through supernatural causation, but through the interplay of unconscious motivation, selective attention, and possibly subtler forms of influence that current science doesn't adequately model. The anger-avoidant person doesn't just randomly encounter statistically more angry people. They notice anger more acutely when it's present. They interpret ambiguous interactions as hostile through the lens of their unacknowledged rage. And they may unconsciously provoke others in ways that elicit the very aggression they consciously want to avoid, creating a feedback loop where the external environment increasingly mirrors the internal state they refuse to own. The environment isn't conspiring against them. The psyche is orchestrating encounters that force confrontation with the disowned material, because integration requires first seeing what's been hidden. The social dimension of synchronicity adds yet another layer of complexity that challenges individualist models of consciousness. People in close relationships, intimate partnerships, parent-child bonds, therapeutic dyads, deep friendships often report shared synchronicities that can't be reduced to individual psychology. They think of each other at the exact same moment despite being physically separated. They dream similar or identical content on the same night without prior discussion of the themes. They both encounter the same highly unusual symbol or phrase in completely unrelated contexts within hours of each other. Conventional psychology struggles with these reports because they require accepting some form of information transfer or correlation that doesn't operate through known communication channels. No phone calls, no texts, no shared environment or conversation to explain the overlap. Jung proposed the collective unconscious as the substrate where this occurs, a shared psychic field that individuals participate in without being consciously aware of it, analogous to how fish participate in the ocean. Modern theories emerging from fields like quantum biology, systems theory, and consciousness studies offer alternative frameworks that don't require accepting Jung's entire theoretical edifice, but still allow for the possibility that entanglement, resonance, or morphic fields between coupled systems might account for some of these phenomena without requiring explicitly mystical or supernatural explanations. Regardless of the mechanism, and the mechanism remains genuinely unknown, the experiential reality reported by countless people across cultures is that synchronicities sometimes occur between individuals in ways that can't be plausibly reduced to individual psychology, confirmation bias, or coincidence. They function as relational events, revealing something about the unconscious connection, attunement, or resonance between the individuals involved, suggesting that consciousness might operate not just within isolated brains, but within and between relational fields. One way to work with synchronicities constructively without falling into either rigid dismissal or uncritical magical thinking is through careful documentation and sustained reflection over time. When a meaningful coincidence occurs, resist the immediate impulse to interpret it, to assign definitive meaning, or to use it as confirmation of beliefs you already hold. Instead, record the event with as much specificity and detail as possible.
What were you thinking about, feeling, or dealing with internally when it happened? What exactly was the external event? Not your interpretation of it, but the bare facts. What meaning did you immediately, reflexively assign to it in the moment? Then deliberately step back. Create space. Wait. See if additional context emerges over days, weeks, or even months that clarifies whether the coincidence was genuinely pointing towards something real and actionable, or whether it was pattern-matching noise, your psyche constructing temporary meaning from random overlap. The key practice here is separating the immediate emotional impact, which with genuine synchronicities is
Often intense, accompanied by a feeling of significance that's almost numinous, from the interpretive meaning your mind constructs in response. Synchronicities feel meaningful. That's part of their psychological function and possibly their deeper purpose. But feeling significant doesn't automatically mean that the specific interpretation your rational mind generates in the aftermath is accurate or useful. Sometimes the meaning is exactly what it appears to be on first glance. Sometimes the meaning reveals itself to be different, deeper, or more subtle than initially assumed. And sometimes the real meaning is simply that your psyche is more active than usual, more engaged with symbolic process, more alert to pattern. And that heightened state itself is the primary information worth noting, regardless of whether any particular coincidence points toward external action. Another approach that proves psychologically useful involves treating synchronicities as invitations to inquiry rather than as directives for action. When something meaningful occurs, when the boundary between inner and outer becomes momentarily transparent, instead of asking, "What is the universe telling me to do?" which outsources agency to an imagined external authority, ask, "What internal material is this highlighting that I haven't been fully seeing?" If you keep encountering representations of travel, movement, migration, or journeying in various forms, it might not mean you should literally pack up and relocate to another city or country. It might mean that some part of your psyche feels trapped, stagnant, or confined by current circumstances and is seeking expression, integration, or acknowledgement. The synchronicity becomes diagnostic rather than prescriptive. If you encounter the same person repeatedly in unlikely contexts, or if a particular theme keeps appearing across dreams, conversations, media you consume, and random encounters, it might not be destiny or fate telling you this person is your soulmate or this theme is your life's purpose. It might be your unconscious flagging something unresolved, some psychological material that needs conscious engagement, some aspect of yourself reflected in that person or theme that requires integration. This shift from external authority to internal process is subtle but profound. The synchronicity becomes a mirror rather than a message, a prompt for self-inquiry rather than a command from cosmic forces. This approach is less romantic, less dramatic, less likely to generate compelling stories about universal guidance. But it's psychologically more grounded and more useful in the long term because it empowers the person to engage with the material actively, to take responsibility for their own interpretation and choices, rather than passively waiting for signs to tell them what to do or who to become. The paradox that sits at the center of all engagement with synchronicity is this: the more desperately you seek signs, the less meaningful they become. The more you try to force the universe to speak to you, to demand cosmic confirmation of your choices or validation of your path, the more you're ultimately just talking to yourself through the mechanism of confirmation bias, seeing what you need to see rather than what's actually there. But the more you cultivate genuine presence, moment-to-moment awareness without agenda, the more you engage with symbolic process through dreams, active imagination, and artistic expression, the more you allow yourself to be genuinely surprised by meaning rather than demanding it conform to pre-existing expectations, the more frequently authentic synchronicities occur. Not because you've unlocked cosmic favor or because the universe rewards spiritual practice with personalized communication, but because you've fundamentally shifted the quality of consciousness you're bringing to ordinary experience. You've become less defended, less filtered by habitual categorization,
more available to what's actually present in the field of awareness rather than what you expect, fear, or need to be there. And in that state of availability and receptivity, connections become visible that were previously obscured by the noise of agenda-driven thinking, by the constant internal monologue that narrates experience rather than allowing it to be directly encountered. The signs, if we're using them,
That language were always there. The universe, conceived not as an entity with intentions, but as the totality of what is, was always speaking through pattern, through the coherence that emerges spontaneously from complex systems. What changes is your capacity to listen without immediately translating everything into confirmation of pre-existing beliefs or fears. You learn to hear the ambiguity, to sit with the productive discomfort of meaning but hasn't yet resolved into clear interpretation, to let the pattern reveal itself gradually over time rather than forcing premature closure in the moment of occurrence. And that patience, that willingness to not know while remaining radically open, is ultimately what allows synchronicity to function as it perhaps was always meant to. Not as proof of metaphysical truth or validation of spiritual status, but as ongoing invitation into deeper, more participatory relationship with the fundamental mystery of how consciousness and reality interpenetrate, influence each other, and co-create meaning in ways that remain, for now and perhaps necessarily, beyond complete rational explanation or reduction to mechanism.